Hi everyone, today I'll be talking about the neuroendocrine system, and to do that I'd like to start by diving into a bit of an extreme but hopefully nonetheless interesting case study. So, in the center of the brain controlling your sleep-wake cycles, there's this hub of neurons that are denoted as orexin neurons because they use a neuropeptide called orexin to control how awake or how asleep you are. So, let's go ahead and zoom in to this small hub of neurons, these orexin neurons, and let's say that hypothetically somehow, maybe through a brain trauma, maybe through some sort of congenital condition, 90% of those orexin neurons were destroyed or somehow not present. So, as you can see through this diagram, the orexin neurons are really important for signaling to an entire interconnected network of other systems in the brain, including but not limited to the limbic system, hypothalamic arousal regions that actually control how awake you are, dopamine production network, and the endocrine system, which releases hormones. Don't worry about knowing all of these structures. This is just a general overview of some of the places that orexin neurons signal to, and this is a very common theme in the brain that even just one small hub or cluster of neurons is more than the sum of its parts, you might say, because it has so many connections to so many different other networks in the brain that rely on its inputs. And so, what happens when orexin neurons are destroyed is, in extreme cases, you'll actually get type 1 narcolepsy, which, if you don't know, is a sleep condition in which you have no control over your transitions between waking and being asleep. And so, let's say, for example, that you are driving in a car. If you have narcolepsy, there's a possibility that you might, without your control or your volition, fall asleep behind the wheel. And another side effect of narcolepsy in severe cases could be cataplexy, where you completely suddenly lose muscle tone because of sudden transitions to sleep. And unfortunately, alongside narcolepsy, there's a correlated increased risk factor for things such as cardiovascular disease as well as metabolic dysregulation. And so the point of this particular case study was to say that you might think that individual neurons by themselves, it's not all that important if they get damaged just because of the relatively small proportion of neurons that they make up in the entire brain, but actually each individual hub is typically part of a much larger system of neurons. And so I just wanted to make this point to show that the neuroendocrine system and really every neural network in the brain is part of a much more intricate and interconnected system. So with that, I'll move on to explaining some of the fundamental terminology of the neuroendocrine system. And every single day, the goal of the neuroendocrine system and your body in general is to achieve homeostasis. And what homeostasis is it's this internal equilibrium of bodily conditions, and there are various bodily conditions that are being referred to here. One of them is your body temperature, your glucose level so that you don't suddenly pass out just because you haven't eaten in a few hours, and your blood pressure, among others. And the goal is to maintain these bodily conditions within a certain range regardless of environmental conditions. So, for example, just because you're out in the snow, your body temperature should still be within a certain range. It shouldn't suddenly drop to freezing temperatures. So that's some examples of homeostasis. And one of the ways that your body maintains homeostasis is by releasing hormones, which are chemical signals that are responsible for inducing or altering activity of the tissues that they target by triggering these molecular signaling cascades. So to break down that definition a little bit, hormones, which are chemical signals, one of the ways that they travel to target tissues is through the bloodstream. So let's say, according to this diagram here, that you have some sort of a hormone that's being released because your body needs to use it in order to initiate some response that would allow for the maintenance of homeostasis. And so once that hormone reaches a cell on the organ tissue, it'll bind to an external cellular receptor, and that chemical binding to a cellular receptor will initiate an internal molecular signaling cascade, which is to say that within the cell, genetic or non-genetic cellular behavioral modifications will be made, and that'll allow the organ tissue to change its behavior in such a way that will allow for the maintenance of homeostasis. Now that we have that introduction to some of the fundamentals of the neuroendocrine system, I'd like to introduce some of the actual brain structures that are responsible for bridging your brain with the rest of your body to allow for this maintenance of homeostasis. And so the two structures I'd like to highlight here in this diagram are the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland itself is divided into two parts, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Later in this presentation, I'll cover some of the differences in the function between these two parts of the pituitary gland. For now, all you need to know is that the hypothalamus and pituitary are thought of as control center endocrine glands, and they're part of the neuroendocrine system, but really what they essentially do is they bridge the brain and the rest of the body so that the brain can internally sense what condition the body is in and then release various control hormones in order to allow the body to return to certain ranges of homeostasis if necessary. Additionally, just some anatomical things to know, the hypothalamus is directly above the pituitary and thus signals to the pituitary so that the pituitary can then send signals to the rest of the body. Additionally, the anterior and posterior pituitary will release different hormones. As I said, I'll cover that a little bit more in depth later. Now that we've covered some of the fundamentals of the neuroendocrine system as well as homeostasis, I'd like to do a deeper dive into the structure and operations of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So here we have a zoom in on the actual structure of the hypothalamus, and in this particular context, there are two different nuclei that I would like to highlight, and those are the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. The paraventricular nucleus is responsible for the synthesis of oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. These are two different hormones, and I'll discuss their functions more in depth later in this slide. The supraoptic nucleus is responsible also for the synthesis of antidiuretic hormone, and so these nuclei are responsible for sending those hormones as needed to the pituitary gland so that they can be released under the appropriate circumstances. So I'll do a deeper dive into that, but first, let's talk a little bit more about the pituitary gland. As I mentioned before, the pituitary gland has two different parts, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, and those different parts are going to be responsible for the release of different hormones. The anterior pituitary actually releases more hormones than the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary releases two different types of hormones: trophic hormones, of which there are 5, and non-endocrine hormones, of which there are 2. In future slides, I'm going to dive more deeply into the distinction between these two different types of hormones, as well as the actual functions of the individual hormones released by the anterior pituitary. So for now, just know that there are two different classes of hormones released by the anterior pituitary. Moving on to the posterior pituitary, this is where the paraventricular nucleus and supraoptic nucleus really come into play. So the posterior pituitary releases oxytocin, which again is produced by the paraventricular nucleus, and oxytocin is known as the social bonding hormone because it increases feelings of rapport and friendliness when you're in a social scene and surrounded by other people. Additionally, oxytocin is responsible for a lot of feelings of maternal instinct, and it's responsible also for promoting the production of milk after giving birth, and it's also responsible for inducing contractions when a woman goes into labor. The second hormone that's released by the posterior pituitary is antidiuretic hormone, which is abbreviated as ADH. Another common name for antidiuretic hormone is vasopressin, and this is the hormone that's produced by the paraventricular nucleus as well as the supraoptic nucleus. The main role of antidiuretic hormone is to increase water retention within the body when internal sensors determine that salt concentrations within the blood have gotten too high. And so essentially what occurs is this very cool feedback mechanism in which the body will sense and determine that salt concentrations are too high, report that to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will increase the production of antidiuretic hormone, and then the pituitary will release antidiuretic hormone, which will then cause kidneys to increase water retention. So that's yet another example of how the neuroendocrine system allows for the maintenance of certain bodily conditions like salt concentration levels within a very specific range, regardless of external conditions. Additionally, a quick anatomical note, the infundibulum is essentially this stalk or highway that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Now, as promised, I'm going to dive more into the different types of hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary. So I'm going to divide this into two sections, the trophic hormones and the non-endocrine hormones, which will be discussed on the next slide. First, I'll define what a trophic hormone actually is. So this is a particular type of hormone whose job it is to promote growth, maintenance, and nourishment in target tissues, particularly through the stimulation of other endocrine glands to secrete their own hormones. The first trophic hormone that I'll cover here is thyroid-stimulating hormone, which is abbreviated to TSH. Thyroid-stimulating hormone is the hormone that's actually released by the anterior pituitary gland. That hormone then travels to an external gland that's in the neck called the thyroid gland, and upon binding of TSH in cells within the thyroid gland will then know how to regulate the release of its own hormones for the regulation of metabolism. So, by receiving signals from the pituitary gland, the thyroid will essentially know how to regulate its activity and the release of its own hormones that control metabolic rate. The next hormone I'll cover is adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, and upon the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary, it'll travel via the bloodstream to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are, again, glands that are external to the brain, and they're located on the tops of the kidneys as depicted in the diagram, and upon binding of ACTH to cells in the adrenal gland, which is itself an endocrine gland, will be prompted to release another hormone called cortisol. And cortisol, when it's released from the adrenal glands, will stimulate a lot of different factors that contribute to the stress response. And I'll dive a little bit more into the nuances of the stress response after this. The next hormone that's released by the anterior pituitary is melanocyte-stimulating hormone, or MSH for short, and this hormone creates skin and hair pigmentation, which will then also provide UV protection. So essentially, MSH will bind to cells within the skin, and then those cells will release pigmentation. Next, I'll cover luteinizing hormone, or LH for short. Luteinizing hormone regulates ovulation and the cycling of other sex hormones, so luteinizing hormone actually works with the next hormone, which is follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH for short, and follicle-stimulating hormone regulates follicle development in the ovaries, which is important for reproduction, and in the case of a male, it'll regulate sperm development. So this is just the basic overview of the 5 different trophic hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary. Before I move on to talking about the non-endocrine hormones released from the anterior pituitary, I would like to dive a little bit more into the stress response, which, as you'll recall, is initiated by the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, from the anterior pituitary. So the stress response will begin with some sort of a sensory perception of a stimulus. So, for example, in this case, we have a visual stimulus of a bear sighting that is relayed to the occipital lobe at the posterior part of the brain, or the back of the brain, where visual stimuli are processed. And so upon the perception of this visual stimulus of a bear in this scenario, you will have the recognition of fear, because it's no good for your survival if you just see a bear and go about your day. You should have some sort of a fear response to the bear so that you can run away from it or escape from it or have some sort of a fight or flight response that'll help you survive this encounter. So this visual stimulus will be relayed to the amygdala, which is a small structure in the brain that's highlighted here in this diagram, and the amygdala is responsible for actually creating the emotion of fear upon the receival of some sort of a stimulus that is encoded as being detrimental or dangerous to your survival. So then, upon the recognition of this fear sensation, a neuroendocrine cascade is triggered, and so the hypothalamus will release corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, to the pituitary gland through that stalk that connects them called the infundibulum, and then CRH will signal the pituitary gland to release ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will then travel through the bloodstream to the adrenal glands, and finally the adrenal glands will release cortisol in order to initiate a final stress response. And so, to dive into what a stress response actually entails within the body, essentially, there are many things, but a couple things to highlight. Your arteries will constrict, which is to say that they will become smaller in diameter in order to increase your blood pressure so that more nutrients and oxygen is being delivered to your muscles so that you can go into fight or flight mode if necessary. And additionally, heart rate variability is going to occur so that your heart rate increases in order to support increased blood flow and blood pumping to your muscles so that you can evade this dangerous situation. And there are other factors in the stress response, but these are some important things to highlight. Okay. Additionally, an important part of increased blood flow is that you're going to have increased blood flow to your brain, and so that'll allow for more delivery of nutrients and oxygen to important parts of your brain, like the frontal lobe, that are going to help you think and plan and be fast on your feet with finding a strategy for escape. Okay. Now I'm going to cover the anterior pituitary non-endocrine hormones. And so, as opposed to the trophic hormones, non-endocrine hormones are going to be responsible for acting on non-hormone secreting tissues in order to maintain homeostasis. So, just once again, the difference is non-endocrine hormones are not going to be targeting endocrine tissues outside of the brain. So, the first non-endocrine hormone that I would like to point out is the growth hormone. And so growth hormone is responsible for bone and cartilage growth in children. It's also responsible for muscle repair and metabolism regulation in adults. And so you might ask, why is this a non-endocrine hormone given that it's still triggering a big physiological change and obviously has some sort of a target tissue in the bone? The reason it's a non-endocrine hormone is that the bone itself will not act as an endocrine gland upon the binding of growth hormone. The bone will not release some sort of a hormone when growth hormone binds. It'll just have this physiological change, which is to grow in response. The next hormone I'll cover is prolactin. So prolactin regulates breast development, metabolism, and immune function. So it's a pretty versatile hormone. Those are just some of its functions to be familiar with. Another thing I would like to cover is the actual in-depth mechanism of how some of these hormones work once they bind to cells. I've been saying that, these hormones bind to cells and then some response occurs, but I would like to give you guys a little bit more of an explanation of how a physiological change is actually triggered once the hormone binds. So let's say that you have growth hormone binding to a cell. And so what happens is once that chemical growth hormone binds to receptors on the cell surface, the JAK-STAT pathway, which is an internal molecular pathway within the cell, will be triggered. And so you don't need to memorize everything in this diagram, but basically what happens is growth hormone binds to the receptor, and then all of these proteins within the cell that are part of what's called the JAK-STAT pathway are going to be activated so that you get this output of some sort of a change in gene expression, which will cause the physiological change that's intended. Okay, thank you guys so much for listening to this lecture. I hope that it was helpful for learning about the neuroendocrine system, and I'll see you in the next one.